It was a quiet evening in the small suburban town of Maplewood, where life seemed to move at a slower pace. The sun dipped behind rows of neatly trimmed houses, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Birds chirped, and the hum of distant traffic barely reached the ear. In Maplewood, the biggest concerns were the rising cost of groceries and whether or not the lawnmower would start. But behind the well-kept fences, manicured gardens, and white picket fences, there were secrets. Secrets that would soon surface in a way that no one could have ever predicted. Maggie Saunders was, on the surface, the epitome of the perfect wife and mother. She was in her early 40s, with a warm smile and blonde hair that always seemed to bounce with life. Her husband, Tom, was a respected local banker, always wearing a crisp suit, walking with confidence as if he had everything figured out. They had two children, Jason, a high school sophomore, and Emma, a younger daughter who was still in elementary school. The family was well liked in the neighborhood, often hosting weekend barbecues and attending local events. It seemed like they had the perfect life. However, behind the closed doors of their home, things weren't always so pristine. Maggie had been feeling restless for months, a nagging feeling of dissatisfaction creeping up on her. Tom, despite being a kind man, was absorbed in his work, leaving Maggie to tend to the home and children. She often found herself staring out the window, longing for something more, something that would reignite the spark she once felt in her marriage. Enter Adam Wilson. Adam was 21, the son of their next-door neighbors, John and Lisa Wilson. He had just moved back into his childhood home after completing his first year of college. He was handsome, with dark hair that fell carelessly over his eyes and a lean, muscular frame from years of athletic activity. Adam was everything Tom wasn't: young, spontaneous, and full of energy. He had an air of confidence that attracted attention, and he was friendly to everyone, always with a warm smile, a joke, and a hand ready to help. Maggie first noticed him when he helped her carry groceries to her door one afternoon. They exchanged pleasantries, and he made a lighthearted comment about the weather. It seemed innocent enough, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart race for a moment. She dismissed the thought, reminding herself that she was happily married. But as the days passed, Adam continued to pop in and out of her life, always with that same charm and easygoing attitude. It wasn't long before their casual conversations turned into deeper ones. Maggie found herself enjoying their chats more than she expected. Adam would talk about his dreams, his studies, and the world beyond Maplewood. Maggie shared her own frustrations, how she felt unnoticed, how she longed for excitement. It wasn't until one late afternoon, when she was gardening in the front yard, that things began to shift. Adam came over to offer help again. His gentle touch as he adjusted her gardening tools seemed innocent at first, but when his fingers brushed against her hand, something sparked inside her. The touch lingered a moment too long, and Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She felt an unfamiliar heat flush through her body. She quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the flowers in front of her. "Sorry," Adam said, his voice low and apologetic. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But Maggie wasn't uncomfortable. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but it wasn't discomfort. She was confused. The attraction she felt for Adam, although unexpected, was undeniable. She could feel a tension growing between them, a pull that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. Her mind raced as she thought about Adam. She knew she was married, but there was something about him that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept coming back, stronger than before. Was it just a fleeting infatuation, or was it something more? Days passed, and the encounters between Maggie and Adam grew more frequent. A shared cup of coffee here, a quick chat in the yard there. Maggie started to feel guilty, but she also couldn't deny the attraction building between them. Adam seemed to know exactly what to say, how to make her laugh, how to make her feel special. Each time they spoke, the connection between them deepened, and Maggie found herself yearning for more. One night, after Tom had left for a business trip, Maggie was sitting on the porch, sipping a glass of wine. Adam happened to be outside as well, tending to his own yard. They exchanged a few words, and before Maggie knew it, he was sitting next to her. The evening air was warm, and the soft glow of the porch light bathed them both in a golden hue. Maggie could feel her pulse quicken as Adam's proximity became more intense. He was close, too close. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable," Adam said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I've really enjoyed our time together, Maggie. I think you're a beautiful woman." Maggie's breath hitched. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. The way he was looking at her, with those dark, smoldering eyes, made her feel things she hadn't felt in years. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. Adam moved a little closer, and before she knew it, his lips brushed against hers. The kiss was gentle at first, but then it deepened, and Maggie's body responded against her will. She pulled away quickly, her breath shallow, her heart racing. I I can't," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "I'm married." Adam looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I understand, but sometimes people need something different, something real." Maggie stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How had she let this go so far? She turned and walked inside, locking the door behind her. But the memory of that kiss lingered in her mind, igniting a fire she wasn't sure how to put out. The next day, things were different. Maggie couldn't stop thinking about Adam, but she also knew that what had happened couldn't be ignored. It was a mistake, an impulsive, reckless mistake. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure if she could go back. But as the days turned into weeks, Maggie found herself drawn to Adam more and more. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but so did the desire. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop herself. And what Maggie didn't know was that this would be the beginning of a series of events that would spiral out of control, leading to a murder that no one saw coming. The truth, once uncovered, would reveal how a seemingly harmless affair could destroy everything. The days after Maggie's encounter with Adam felt like a blur. She moved through her life as if she were walking through fog. Her mind constantly clouded with thoughts of him, the weight of the decision she had made pressing heavily on her chest. It was strange how something so thrilling and forbidden could feel so right and so wrong at the same time. Her relationship with Tom, her husband of over 15 years, was no longer the anchor it had once been. The steady rhythm of their life together had given way to something messy and complicated, something Maggie wasn't sure she was prepared to deal with. But every time Adam came into her life, every stolen moment they shared, the sense of longing grew. Maggie couldn't deny it any longer. She had crossed a line, and though part of her screamed for her to stop, another part of her was too far gone to turn back. It all started to feel like a game to Adam. At first it seemed innocent enough, small gestures, moments of affection that didn't mean much. But soon he began pushing the boundaries in ways Maggie couldn't ignore. He showed up at her door more often, each time with a different excuse. "Just wanted to check in on you. I thought you might need help with something." Or even, "I'm bored, want to hang out for a bit." The tension between them grew every time their paths crossed. Adam was no longer content with just casual conversations or quick exchanges. He wanted more, and Maggie knew it. Yet each time he came around, she found herself unable to resist him. There was a magnetism to him that made her feel alive, made her feel wanted in ways she hadn't in years. And when she was with him, she didn't think about Tom, or the consequences, or the guilt that gnawed at her insides. One late afternoon, as she was finishing up dinner preparations, Maggie's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the screen. It was, "Adam, want to meet at the park in 20 minutes? Just for a walk. I need to talk to you." Her stomach fluttered. What did he want to talk about? The idea of seeing him again made her pulse quicken, but her fingers hesitated over the screen. She glanced toward the hallway where her children were occupied in the living room. Tom wouldn't be back from his trip for another few hours. It felt like a dangerous invitation, but the excitement was too much to ignore. She typed back, "Okay, see you soon." The park was only a few blocks away, a quiet green space that most families in Maplewood use for picnics and casual walks. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, far from prying eyes. Maggie couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her as she walked toward it. She kept telling herself it was just a walk, just a conversation. But deep down, she knew that whatever was about to happen would not stay innocent for long. When she arrived at the park, Adam was already there, leaning against a tree waiting. He looked even more handsome in the fading light of evening, his dark eyes locking onto hers the moment she appeared. His smile was inviting, yet there was something else in his gaze, something possessive. "Hey," he said casually, as though nothing had changed, as though they weren't standing at the edge of a precipice. "Hey," Maggie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. They started walking along the path, their steps in sync, but the silence between them felt heavy. Maggie's mind raced as she tried to figure out what Adam wanted. She had told herself after their last encounter that it would be the last time. But here she was, once again, in his presence, feeling the pull of something dangerous. "How's your week been?" Adam asked, his tone light, but there was an underlying tension in his voice. "It's been fine. You know, busy with the kids and everything." Maggie's response felt rehearsed, like she was trying to play it safe, to keep the conversation from heading into more dangerous territory. Adam nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. After a few more steps, he spoke again, this time with a serious edge. "Maggie, I need to know something. Are you happy? I mean, truly happy. With your life? With Tom?" Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that question, and for a moment her mind went blank. The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I I don't know," she said finally, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I thought I was, but lately, things have felt different." Adam looked at her closely, his eyes dark with something that Maggie couldn't quite place. Concern, or perhaps something more intense. "Maggie, you deserve more than this. You deserve to feel alive, to feel desired. I can give you that. I already do, don't I?" Maggie's heart raced. She knew exactly what he was doing, but part of her wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was more to life than the monotony she had settled into with Tom. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, to let him take her hand and lead her into the world she knew they could build together. But then reality crashed back in. Tom, her children, the life she had worked so hard to create. "Adam, She started, but he interrupted her, his voice low and insistent. "You don't have to say it, Maggie. I already know. I felt it between us. You're just afraid to admit it. But we both know what we want. We both know what's real." Maggie stopped walking, turning to face him. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. She could feel his breath on her face, could see the way his chest rose and fell with every breath he took. Everything inside her screamed to walk away, to go home. But a deeper part of her, one she didn't want to acknowledge, wanted nothing more than to let go, to fall into this madness. "Please don't make this harder," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never felt this way before. You're not the only one who's been holding back. I need you, Maggie." Before she could stop him, Adam reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his lips brushing against hers with a sense of urgency that took her breath away. For a moment, Maggie stood frozen, torn between the desire that surged through her and the warning bells that screamed in her mind. But then, as if all the decisions of the past few weeks had led to this moment, she kissed him back. It was a kiss that felt both reckless and necessary. It was a kiss that sealed her fate. As they pulled apart, Maggie's mind was spinning. She was overwhelmed, unsure of what she had just done, but unable to deny the fire that had been lit inside her. Adam smiled, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and longing. "You can't keep denying it, Maggie," he said softly. "We're in this now, and there's no turning back." Maggie swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She had just crossed a line, and as she stood there looking into Adam's eyes, she realized that she couldn't see a way out. The rest of the walk back to her car was silent, each step weighed down by the heavy realization of what she had just agreed to. Her life, her marriage, was changing in ways she hadn't prepared for. And as much as she wanted to walk away, as much as she knew she couldn't. The pull of Adam was too strong, and she was already too far gone. But what Maggie didn't know was that, unbeknownst to her, someone else had been watching. Someone had seen them, and this was only the beginning. The evening had turned cold by the time Maggie drove back to her house. the weight of her actions still pressing heavily on her chest. The excitement from the stolen kiss still buzzed in her veins, but it was quickly replaced by a growing dread. The idea of what she had just done, the reality of it, started sinking in, and she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense that her life was spiraling out of control. Her hand gripped the steering wheel tighter as the streetlights blurred past her. She didn't know how to stop it anymore. But Maggie wasn't the only one who had seen what had happened that evening. Across the street from the park, hidden in the shadows of a tree-lined corner, a pair of eyes watched every movement. The figure stood still, the silhouette barely visible in the dim light, ensuring not a single moment was missed. From the moment Adam and Maggie had met, to the intimate kiss they shared in the quiet of the park, it was all seen. The watcher made no sound, no movement, just an observer, calculating, taking in every detail. This person had been watching Maggie for some time now. They knew her routine, her habits, her comings and goings. The watcher had seen her walk to the mailbox, play with her children in the yard, and even greet Adam when he'd come over. But tonight it was different. They had seen the connection, something darker, something more than just neighborly friendliness. The kiss had been the final piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocked the watcher's understanding of what was happening. The figure turned and silently slipped into the shadows, disappearing from sight as they made their way back to a place where secrets were hidden and consequences carefully measured. This wasn't the first time they had been so close, but it would be the last. Back at the Saunders home, Maggie stepped through the front door, her hands shaking slightly as she closed it behind her. The house was eerily quiet. Tom wouldn't be back until late that night, and the kids were already in bed, likely exhausted from their school day. Maggie paused for a moment in the foyer, staring at the empty space before her. She wanted to collapse, to let out the emotions that were bubbling up inside her. But she knew she had to pull herself together. She couldn't let Tom suspect anything. With a deep sigh, she walked into the kitchen and put her things down, trying to focus on the small, mundane task of washing the dishes. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept drifting back to Adam, his touch, his kiss, the way he made her feel seen in a way Tom hadn't in years. Maggie wasn't sure if it was love or infatuation, but in that moment, she didn't care. She only knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't undo what had already happened. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her from her reverie. It was a message from Adam. "I can't stop thinking about tonight. I need you, Maggie, more than you know." Maggie's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. It was as if he had written exactly what she had been feeling. She quickly typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. "I know, I can't stop either. But we need to be careful. This can't get out of hand." The reply came almost instantly. "I don't care about careful anymore. I care about you." Maggie felt a pang of guilt mixed with something else, something darker and more dangerous. She knew she should stop, tell him to stay away, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She wanted him too much. She felt like she was drowning in the desire for something more than the life she had. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted Maggie from her thoughts. It was Tom. He had arrived earlier than expected. Her heart raced. She quickly put her phone down and walked to the front door, plastering a smile on her face as she opened it. Tom stepped inside, his usual easygoing smile in place as he removed his jacket. "Hey, hun, how was your day?" "Good," Maggie said, her voice a little too high-pitched. She cleared her throat, trying to calm the nerves that were bubbling up inside her. "How was yours?" Tom shrugged, setting his briefcase down. "Same old. Another day, another meeting." He smiled, walking toward the kitchen. "You okay? You look a little tense." Maggie's smile faltered, but she quickly forced it back into place. "I'm fine. Just a little tired. It's been a long week." Tom gave her a look of concern, then reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You sure? I can tell something's on your mind." Maggie flinched slightly at his touch, though she quickly masked it with a laugh. "I'm sure. Just stressed. You know how it is." Tom nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Maggie felt a pang of guilt. She knew she was hiding something from him. She was lying to him about Adam, about everything, and Tom would never know. As Tom went to change out of his suit, Maggie's phone buzzed again, this time with an unfamiliar number. Her heart stopped for a moment. She glanced at the message. "I saw what you did. I won't tell, not yet. But you should know. I'm watching." Maggie's blood ran cold. For a moment, she just stared at the words, the shock of them sinking in slowly. The room felt suddenly too small, too stifling. Who could have sent this? How did they know? Was it Adam? Had he sent the message as a joke? Or was there someone else, someone she didn't even know, watching her? The thought of being watched made her feel exposed, vulnerable. Maggie's hands shook as she put the phone down and turned away, walking into the living room. She tried to breathe steadily, to calm her racing thoughts, but the message lingered in her mind like a dark shadow. Who had seen them? More importantly, why did they say they were watching? What did they want? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Tom's voice calling from upstairs. "Maggie, you coming to bed soon?" Maggie forced a smile, but inside she felt a growing sense of dread. "Yeah, I'll be up in a minute." As she stood there staring out the window, she realized just how far she had fallen. She had crossed a line with Adam, yes, but now there was something else. Something far more dangerous. She was no longer in control. Someone else knew her secret. And the worst part was, Maggie wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Meanwhile, across town, a seasoned investigator sat at his desk, reviewing the case file in front of him. Detective Raymond Graves had seen it all: domestic disturbances, petty thefts, murders, and everything in between. But there was something about this case that felt different, something that was eating at the back of his mind. The case had started with a simple call, a body found in a local park. But the deeper Graves dug, the more layers he uncovered. He had been tracing the connections between people in the neighborhood, trying to piece together the story. Adam Wilson's name kept cropping up, as did Maggie Saunders. The affair, the whispers around town, the unexplained tension. It all started making sense. Graves had heard about Adam's close relationship with his neighbors. He knew about the Wilsons, and he knew that Adam had returned to Maplewood after his first year of college. He'd heard the rumors about Maggie Saunders, how her marriage had been on the rocks for a while, how she had been acting strangely in recent weeks. He had even spoken to a few people who'd seen Adam and Maggie together on more than one occasion. But it wasn't until he received the anonymous tip that everything began to connect. "Someone's been watching," Graves muttered to himself as he sifted through the files. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and Graves had a sinking feeling in his gut. The affair had set off a chain of events, but now there was someone else. Someone more dangerous, waiting in the wings, watching, calculating. And Graves was determined to find out who. The game was far from over, and the truth was just beginning to unfold. The days following Maggie's unsettling discovery of the anonymous message felt like an eternity. Every time she stepped outside, every time she looked out the window, she felt as though she were being watched. Her movements were calculated, cautious, and she was always aware of the shadows creeping around the edges of her life. Even as she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy with Tom, the nagging thought that someone knew her secret haunted her. Maggie found herself glancing nervously at the windows, the front door, and even the mailbox, half expecting to find another message waiting for her. But nothing came. It was as though the watcher had vanished, retreating into the background. Yet the uncertainty never left. Every moment felt tense, as if the other shoe was about to drop. Tom, unaware of the storm brewing in his wife's mind, seemed distracted in his own right. Though he was home more often now, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage had become distant. The casual affection they once shared had evaporated, replaced by a strange tension neither of them acknowledged. The quiet nights spent together in front of the TV felt like empty rituals, mere distractions from the deeper problems lying beneath the surface. Maggie couldn't help but feel that, in a way, Tom had become just another part of the facade she was maintaining. She was drifting further away from him with every passing day. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Raymond Graves was hard at work on his own investigation. The discovery of the body in the park had sent ripples through Maplewood, a small, quiet town where murders were rare and the community was tight-knit. At first, the case had seemed straightforward: a man found dead in a public park. But Graves quickly realized there was more to it. It wasn't just a random crime. The evidence led him to one central figure, Adam Wilson. Graves had started with Adam's background. A college dropout who had returned to Maplewood, Adam was the son of local business owners. The town had always known him as a friendly, charming young man, someone who was well liked by his neighbors. But Graves knew there was something off about him. No one had ever seen Adam get too close to anyone, except for a few whispers about his flirtations with married women. Those whispers had grown louder recently, and Adam's name had appeared more than once in connection with the body found in the park. There was one particular lead that kept popping up. Maggie Saunders. Graves had heard her name mentioned in passing from a few people who had witnessed her talking to Adam on multiple occasions. He also discovered that Maggie's marriage had been strained for some time, though the details were unclear. The anonymity of the tip-off suggesting someone had been watching Maggie had piqued his interest. Could there be a connection between the affair and the murder? Was Adam involved? Graves started with Maggie. He had learned that she was a stay-at-home mom, married to Tom Saunders, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant at a firm in the city. The couple had 2 children, both still in elementary school. Maggie was well liked by her neighbors, and no one seemed to have any complaints about her, but Graves couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more beneath the surface. He needed to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Graves found himself pulling into the quiet neighborhood where the Saunders family lived. The houses were charming, well-kept, and picturesque, almost as if they had been plucked from the pages of a magazine. Everything about the area seemed perfect. Too perfect. Graves parked his car a few houses down and walked up the sidewalk. He could see Maggie through the front window, moving about the living room. She appeared calm, collected, though Graves could tell there was something off about her, something in the way her eyes darted nervously when she glanced at the door. She had no idea he was watching her, but Graves was sharp. The unease was evident. He knocked on the door and Maggie opened it, greeting him with a warm, friendly smile, though there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Saunders. I'm Detective Graves with the Maplewood Police Department," he said, showing her his badge. "I was hoping we could talk for a moment." Maggie's expression shifted for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Of course, Detective. What's this about?" "I'm investigating the recent incident in the park. The body found there," Graves explained. "I've come to speak with a few of the people in the neighborhood who might have seen something or heard anything unusual. Your name came up a couple of times. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Maggie hesitated. A cold sweat broke out on her palms as she stood there in the doorway. Her mind raced. She had no idea what to say. She had heard rumors about the body being found, but she had hoped that whatever had happened would just go away. Now it was all too real. The investigation had come to her door. "Sure, I guess," Maggie said, forcing herself to remain composed. "But I don't know what I could possibly tell you. I haven't heard anything unusual." Graves gave a reassuring smile. "I understand. I'm just following up on leads. We've heard some reports about a few people who might have seen you talking to someone, Adam Wilson to be exact. Do you know him?" The mention of Adam's name hit Maggie like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. She had to be careful. If she denied knowing Adam or tried to play it off as something innocent, it would only make her look guilty. But she also couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet, not when the consequences were still unclear. "Yes, I know Adam," Maggie replied cautiously. "He's a neighbor. His family lives just a few houses down. And have you been in contact with him recently?" Graves asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Not really," Maggie said quickly, her mind racing. "We've spoken a few times when we've seen each other outside. He's a friendly young man. That's all." Graves nodded, but there was something in Maggie's eyes, something he couldn't place, that made him suspicious. He didn't believe her. Not for a second. He could tell she was hiding something. There was a subtle shift in her body language, an unease in her posture. She was hiding the truth, and he was determined to uncover it. "I understand," Graves said, his voice calm but firm. "I just need to ask one more thing. Do you recall if Adam was around the park the day the body was found?" Maggie's stomach dropped. The park. The same place she and Adam had shared their last secret meeting. She couldn't breathe for a moment. How could he possibly know that? No, she said too quickly, her voice wavering. I, I didn't see him there. I was at home all day. My husband and kids were here too. Graves didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press her further. He had gathered enough for now. He could sense the fear in her voice, the cracks in her facade. He knew she wasn't telling the whole truth. All right, Mrs. Saunders, he said, his voice softening slightly. Thank you for your time. If you remember anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me. Maggie nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, and Graves turned to leave. As he walked back down the sidewalk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer to unraveling the truth. Maggie Saunders knew more than she was letting on. And Adam Wilson? There was something about him too. Graves had seen the way he looked at her, the way they interacted. The connection between them was undeniable. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and Graves knew one thing for sure. This case was far from over. He was getting closer to the answers he sought, and the truth about what had really happened in Maplewood was about to come to light. As Graves walked away from the Saunders house, he had no idea how much deeper the lies ran, or how much closer he was to the dark truth that would soon unravel everything. The Watcher had been watching them all, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale orange light across the town of Maplewood. The quiet, tree-lined streets, so familiar and comforting, now felt like a suffocating cage. Maggie Saunders could barely breathe under the weight of the secret she was carrying. Every day that passed felt like a step closer to being discovered. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The investigation was closing in on her, and there was nowhere to hide. After Detective Graves had visited her that morning, Maggie had spent the rest of the day in a fog. She went through the motions of household chores, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying her conversation with the detective over and over again. The way he had looked at her, his eyes sharp, his voice measured, told her everything she needed to know. He knew something. He was suspicious, and Maggie couldn't afford for him to dig any deeper. She had to get ahead of it. She had to keep control of the situation. It was late in the afternoon when she decided to drive to the park. The familiar, quiet space had always been her refuge. She used to come here for moments of peace, but now it felt different. The air was thick with memories, the smell of fresh grass and damp earth masking the stench of guilt that clung to her like a second skin. As she parked her car by the entrance, Maggie hesitated before stepping out. She glanced at the empty, silent park, her breath shallow. The thought of what had happened here made her stomach turn, but she couldn't stop herself. She needed to see it. She needed to make sure nothing was left behind. Nothing that could tie her to the place. Maggie walked slowly along the path, her eyes scanning the ground. She moved carefully, almost as though she were a criminal, though no one had accused her yet. She had to be sure. Adam had never told her what he had done with the body, but she had to believe he had disposed of all the evidence. After all, they had been careful. They had hidden the truth from the world, and no one had suspected them. Not yet. She came to the small bench where they had shared their kiss, and then she froze. There, just beyond the edge of the path, was a flash of something, a small, crumpled piece of paper that had clearly been discarded. Maggie's heart began to race as she hurried toward it, fear coursing through her veins. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked it up. It was a note scribbled hastily, the ink smudged in places. I know what you did. I'm watching. You'll regret this. The words were a punch to her gut. She felt dizzy, lightheaded. Someone knew. Someone had seen them. Maggie clutched the note tightly, her breath quickening as panic set in. Was this from Adam? Had he left it for her? Or was it someone else? Someone who had witnessed everything. Someone who had been watching them all along. The idea of being exposed made her feel trapped. There was no escape. As she stood up, trying to collect herself, she felt a presence behind her. A voice, low and steady, broke through her thoughts. You shouldn't be here, Maggie. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Adam! He had appeared out of nowhere, his face unreadable, his eyes dark. He stood there just a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking at her with a strange intensity. He hadn't spoken to her since their last meeting, and she wasn't sure how to react. "I had to come," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone left this note. They know." Adam's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. He walked toward her, his steps purposeful. "We've been careful, Maggie. This wasn't supposed to happen. We can't let this slip now. We need to cover our tracks." Maggie looked at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Who could have left this note? It's like they've been watching us." "They have," Adam said quietly, his voice almost cold. "And it's only a matter of time before they go to the police. We have to do something before that happens." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. Adam wasn't just worried about being caught. He was terrified. The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. And suddenly, all the events that had transpired between them, the affair, the lies, the murder, seemed to close in around her. She had never considered what would happen if someone found out. But now with Adam standing before her, it felt all too real. There was no going back. "I didn't know what else to do," Maggie said, her voice shaking with the emotion she had been holding back. "I just wanted something more. I didn't think, I didn't think it would get this far." Adam stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "This wasn't just about you, Maggie. This is bigger than you and me. If we don't shut it down, we're both done for." Maggie nodded, her throat tight. "What do we do?" Adam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He held it out to her. "I know where they're keeping the evidence," he said, his voice low. "I'll take care of it. But you need to stay away. Stay quiet. Don't let anyone get suspicious." Maggie's heart raced as she took the key from him, her hands shaking. "Are you sure?" Adam nodded. "Trust me, I've got it covered. But if we're going to get out of this, we need to be careful. We need to make sure we don't leave anything behind. No loose ends." The next day, Detective Graves found himself back at his desk, reviewing the growing stack of evidence in front of him. His mind kept returning to Maggie Saunders. There was something about her that didn't sit right. She had been too quick to deny knowing Adam Wilson, too eager to act normal when Graves had questioned her. He had seen the flicker of fear in her eyes. She was hiding something, and Graves was determined to find out what. He had spent the morning speaking with people in the neighborhood, and the rumors surrounding Adam and Maggie had only intensified. He had learned from a few sources that Maggie and Adam had been seen together on multiple occasions, always in the same places, near the park, at the local coffee shop, and sometimes just walking around the neighborhood. It was clear to him now there was something going on between them, something more than just casual neighborly interactions. But what? Graves leaned back in his chair, looking at the board in front of him. It was covered in photos, notes, and strings connecting different pieces of information. He had been building a timeline, a trail of events leading up to the body found in the park, and the more he looked at it, the clearer it became. Adam and Maggie's connection was at the center of it all. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Graves looked up to see his partner, Detective Jessica Lane, standing in the doorway, holding a folder. She stepped into the room and placed it on his desk. "I've got something for you," she said, her tone serious. "It's about the note." Graves' eyes narrowed. "What about it?" Lane sat down across from him. "We traced the handwriting. It's from a local printer. The ink matches something they print for businesses around here. We also found a receipt for a printed batch of flyers. They were ordered just a week ago. Whoever left the note knew exactly what they were doing." Graves felt a surge of anticipation. "So we're closer to finding the person behind this." Lane nodded. "And I have a feeling it's going to lead us right back to Maggie Saunders." That evening, as the dark clouds rolled in, Maggie sat in her car outside, the small convenience store where Adam had told her to meet him. She clutched the key in her hand, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Adam's warnings echoed in her mind. Stay quiet. Don't let anyone get suspicious. But as she sat there, something inside her told her that this was all going to unravel. Too many people were involved now. Too many people knew. And no matter how hard she tried to cover her tracks, there was no way out of the mess they had made. Maggie Saunders had never felt more exposed in her life. She had spent weeks lying to everyone she knew, hiding the truth in the shadows, hoping that no one would uncover the secret she had carefully buried. But as the weight of the situation bore down on her, she realized there was no escaping the inevitable. The walls were closing in, and every choice she made seemed to push her closer to the point of no return. It was a chilly evening when she arrived at the convenience store. The streets deserted as rain began to fall in steady rhythmic sheets. The neon sign overhead flickered, casting a pale light that danced across the wet pavement. Maggie sat in her car, the engine idling, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. Her heart raced as she watched the entrance of the store, half expecting Adam to appear from the shadows. It was the first time they'd met like this since the murder, since everything had changed. She glanced down at the key in her hand, the metal cold and sharp. It was a small thing, almost insignificant on its own, but it represented so much more. It was the key to a storage unit where Adam had kept what they had done, everything that could ruin them both. If she didn't go through with this, if she didn't make sure the evidence was gone, everything they had worked so hard to hide would come to light. As Maggie steeled herself to get out of the car, a figure appeared in her rearview mirror. A man, tall and purposeful, stepped out of the shadows and walked toward her vehicle. Maggie's pulse quickened. It wasn't Adam. The face was unfamiliar, but the intense stare and confident stride sent a chill down her spine. Maggie's instinct screamed at her to drive away, to leave before she was caught in whatever was happening. But she didn't move. Not yet. She was paralyzed by the sudden realization that she might be closer to being discovered than she ever thought possible. The man reached her car, and without hesitation, he knocked on the window. Maggie hesitated, her breath caught in her throat before she rolled the window down slightly, just enough to hear him. "Maggie Saunders?" The voice was low, firm. Her stomach twisted. "Yes," she said, trying to mask the panic in her voice. "I'm Detective Graves," he said, holding up his badge. "I need to talk to you. It's about your husband." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Maggie's mind spun in 1,000 directions as she stared at the detective. Tom. He wasn't even involved in this mess, not directly, but everything she had worked so hard to protect, her family, her marriage, was now threatened by the very person who had been pursuing the truth. Graves's eyes never left her as she processed his words, and it wasn't long before he spoke again. "I don't want to make this harder than it has to be, but I need you to come with me," Graves said, his tone calm but insistent. "It's about the murder investigation. It's about Adam Wilson." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Adam. He had already been the focus of Graves' suspicions for some time, but she hadn't expected him to connect her so quickly. She was already trapped, a web of lies and deceit closing in around her. But the thought of Tom being involved in any way sent waves of nausea through her. If Graves was going to question her about her relationship with Adam, would he drag Tom into it, too? Her mind raced. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you think my husband has to do with this?" Graves didn't answer immediately. He stood there for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made Maggie feel as though her every move was under a microscope. Finally he spoke, his voice low, but carrying the weight of an accusation. "Your husband is part of this investigation because someone saw you with Adam recently. Too often, in fact," Graves said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're not as good at covering your tracks as you think you are, Maggie. We've been following leads, and there's more connecting you to Adam than you're willing to admit." Maggie felt a cold rush of fear wash over her. The walls were closing in faster than she could react, and she knew that this conversation was the beginning of the end. She could lie. She could deny everything. But Detective Graves wasn't an amateur. He had already pieced together too much, and the moment she said something wrong, everything she had worked to protect would come crashing down. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I told you everything I know. I don't have anything to do with Adam's problems. You're wrong." Graves leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, as if to ensure she could hear every word. "Maggie, don't lie to me. You may think that you've been careful, but you've left more than one trail. I know about the messages, the secret meetings, and we found a key to a storage unit near here. The same place where we believe Adam has been keeping something we need to see. It's time to tell me everything." Maggie felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The key. She hadn't expected the detectives to find it so soon, but now they were right on her heels. Adam had kept everything hidden, and they had both been foolish to think they could stay ahead of it. There was no more running, no more hiding. As she looked at Graves, something shifted inside her. The guilt, the shame, the fear, all of it washed over her in a single wave. She had been so focused on keeping her secret that she had forgotten the most important thing of all, the consequences of her actions. She had betrayed her husband. She had betrayed herself, and now it was too late to turn back. I, I'll take you to the storage unit, she said, her voice hollow. The confession slipped out before she could stop it, as though her mind had given up fighting her conscience. But please, you have to promise me that Tom won't get involved. He doesn't know anything. This is all me. Please. Graves regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. We'll keep Tom out of this, for now, he said. But if you're lying, Maggie, this will go much worse for you than you think. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she got out of the car, the rain now falling harder as she led Graves toward the storage facility. Each step she took felt heavier than the last. She couldn't look back. She couldn't escape. The drive to the storage facility was agonizingly quiet. Maggie sat in the passenger seat of Graves' car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every few seconds, her mind flashed with the images of what she had done. She had never imagined it would come to this, never thought she would be standing in front of a detective, on the brink of losing everything. They arrived at the facility, a dusty, forgotten place on the outskirts of Maplewood. It was empty and unassuming, a perfect place to hide something dangerous. The storage units were scattered across a large open lot, and Graves guided Maggie toward one of the farthest units. Here we are, Graves said, stopping in front of the unit. Now let's see what you've been hiding. Maggie stood there frozen. The key was still in her hand, cold and heavy. The moment she unlocked the door, everything would be out in the open. There was no going back. As she slid the key into the lock, Maggie felt her breath catch. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath with her. She turned the key and the door creaked open, revealing the small, dark space within. And there it was. Evidence, photos, items, things she had tried to erase from her life, now on full display for Graves to see. Maggie's heart raced as Graves stepped forward, his flashlight illuminating the contents. He didn't say a word at first, simply looking through the evidence with practiced eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice cold. This is it, isn't it, Maggie? This is the proof. Maggie's world collapsed as she realized that the end had come. The truth was finally out, and there was no escape from the consequences of what she had done. In that moment, Maggie Saunders knew that her life, her marriage, her freedom, would never be the same again. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal, it had all led her here, to this moment of reckoning. And as Graves began to take notes, photographing the evidence, Maggie's heart sank. There was no way to undo what had been done, no way to erase the past. All she could do now was face the truth, and the truth would come for her, whether she was ready or not. The room was sterile and cold, the harsh lights overhead casting long shadows on the walls. Maggie Saunders sat in a small, unadorned chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The detective's office felt like a courtroom, a place where no lies could hide, and every ounce of guilt would be exposed. It had been 3 days since Maggie had led Detective Graves to the storage unit. Since then, everything had spiraled out of control. The evidence had been undeniable. Photos, documents, and even the weapon that had ended Nathan's life. Adam Wilson's fingerprints were all over it, but so were Maggie's. The Verani connections between them had been far more tangled than Graves had initially realized, and now the investigation had shifted into something much bigger. Maggie's mind was a blur as she stared at the single file on the desk in front of her. It had her name on it, the file thick with reports, evidence, and photographs that seemed to haunt her even when she wasn't looking at them. The more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no way out. Adam had confessed, and she had admitted her involvement. There were no more lies to tell. Detective Graves sat across from her, his posture stiff but his eyes calm and calculating. His silence had weighed heavily on her over the past few days. She could feel the pressure of the investigation pressing down on her, each day bringing them closer to an inevitable conclusion. "You're probably wondering why you're still here," Graves said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, devoid of judgment, but the way he looked at her suggested he already knew everything. Everything about what had happened, about the affair, the murder, and the cover-up. Maggie swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know why I'm here, Detective," she whispered. "I've already told you everything." Graves took a deep breath and pushed the file in front of her, sliding it across the table. "You've told me a lot, but you haven't told me the whole truth. There are still some gaps in your story that need to be filled in." Maggie's heart beat faster. She didn't want to go over it again. She didn't want to relive the events, the affair, the lies, the murder. But she could feel the walls closing in tighter. The truth, the painful, brutal truth, was already spilling out in every corner of the investigation. She had no choice but to face it now. "Detective, I've already told you that I was involved with Adam," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I told you we had an affair. And I told you what happened the night Nathan was killed. I don't understand what else you need from me." Graves leaned forward, his eyes focused on her. "Maggie, you haven't told me everything. You haven't told me why Adam killed Nathan in the first place. Why didn't he come clean to you, or to anyone, before it all got so far out of control?" Maggie's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't anticipated the question. She had always assumed Adam had acted out of some fit of passion, an argument, a moment of rage. But now, looking back on it, things didn't add up. Adam had been calm, calculating. She had always thought he was the one pushing them into the dark corners of their secret world, but she hadn't known the whole story. I I don't know, Detective. I never asked him why. I didn't want to know. All I cared about was the moment, the escape from my life. I didn't think about anything else." Graves nodded slowly. "It's not unusual for people to shut down when things get too complicated, but Adam had his reasons. It turns out Nathan wasn't just a random target. He was a threat." Maggie's stomach churned. "A threat? What are you talking about?" Graves hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if deciding how much to reveal. He opened the file and pulled out a series of photos, photos that Maggie had never seen before. The first was a picture of Nathan, smiling at a party, a beer in hand. The next was a shot of him outside a local bar, talking to someone. The third was a close-up of a hand holding a piece of paper, a document with Maggie's name written at the top. Graves noticed the confusion on Maggie's face. He didn't wait for her to ask. "That's a copy of your husband's will, Maggie. Nathan had it." Her breath caught in her throat. "The will? That's right," Graves continued. "Nathan had gotten hold of a copy of your husband's will. It was a will that named him as the primary beneficiary in case of Tom's death. The problem was, Nathan wasn't just looking out for himself. He was planning on using that information to blackmail your husband." Maggie's mind raced. She had no idea. Nathan had never told her about the will, and certainly she didn't know about the blackmail. But everything was beginning to click. Adam had killed Nathan not just because of the affair, not just out of jealousy, but because Nathan was threatening everything Adam wanted. Adam wanted control. He wanted everything, and Nathan's plans would have torn that away. Graves leaned back, watching Maggie as she processed the information. "This changes things, Maggie. Adam didn't kill Nathan just out of passion. He killed him because Nathan knew too much. He was going to expose Adam's affair with you and use the will to ruin your family. Adam was terrified of losing everything." Maggie's mind spun as the reality of what had happened sank in. Adam had been afraid. He had been protecting himself. No, protecting them both. She had been swept up in the madness of it all, never once stopping to ask the right questions. Her emotions had blinded her to the larger picture. They had both been part of something so much darker than she had realized. "Then why didn't Adam just tell me the truth?" Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he just—" "Because, Maggie," Graves interrupted, his voice hardening, "he never intended for you to find out. He thought you were just another part of the cover-up, a distraction. But when you came to me, when you told me everything, That's when he realized you weren't going to help him anymore. Maggie's chest tightened as she finally understood. Adam had used her. He had drawn her into his web of lies, making her an accomplice to the murder. She had thought she was just trying to escape her boring life, her marriage. But in reality, she had become a pawn in his game. And now she was paying the price. Graves paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch out between them. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softening. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, "but I can't help you anymore. You're complicit. You're just as responsible as Adam is. You'll be charged, but you'll be given the opportunity to cooperate. The truth is, you were caught up in something you didn't fully understand, but that doesn't change what happened." Maggie's heart sank. It was over. Everything she had worked so hard to protect, the lies, the affair, the murder, had all led to this moment. There was no escape. The truth was out, and no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she would face the consequences of her actions. As Graves stood up and walked toward the door, Maggie remained seated, staring blankly at the file in front of her. The weight of the past few days crushed down on her, and she finally allowed herself to cry. There would be no redemption. There would be no escape. The only thing left was the truth, and it had come for her at last. Maggie Saunders' life, once full of quiet comforts and secrets, had been irrevocably altered. The affair had shattered her marriage, the murder had stolen her peace, and the truth had unraveled everything. There was no more hiding. There was no more pretending. The law would decide her fate now. But as the detective left her alone in the sterile room, Maggie knew one thing for sure. She could never go back to the life she once knew. Everything had changed. The lies, the deceit, the murder. It was all too much to undo, and the truth would haunt her for the rest of her life.